Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a Primarch out there, somewhere in the darkness between the stars, who has never truly died. Not in the way his brothers have. Not with the cold finality of Sanguinius falling to the Warmaster's fists aboard the vengeful spirit, his wings broken and his light extinguished in a moment that would haunt the Blood Angels for the rest of time. Not with the brutal severance of Ferrus Manus losing his head on the black sand of Istvan Fiv, while the forces that were supposed to be his reinforcement turned their weapons on him instead. Not with the slow spiritual unraveling of Lorgar as he knelt before the Chaos powers at Calth and begged to be remade in their image, trading everything he had been for the promise of something more. No. This Primarch has died dozens of times, been beheaded, eviscerated, immolated, thrown naked into the void of space, stabbed through the heart with a weapon forged from the Emperor's own concentrated psychic essence. And every single time, without exception, he has come back. He has woken up in a fresh cell. He has felt his body knit itself together from nothing. He has opened his eyes in fire and stood up again. And yet, somehow, he remains one of the least talked about Primarchs in the broader fandom. His name is in fewer conversations, his story gets told less often, and that is going to change today because his story is extraordinary and it is not over. Not by a very long way. His name is Vulcan. He is the Primarch of the 18th Legion, known to all as the Salamanders. He is a blacksmith, a craftsman, a father to a people who were already his before the Emperor ever found him, and perhaps the only one of the Emperor's 20 sons who could genuinely be called kind. And yes, I am fully aware of how strange that sounds when we are talking about a 10,000-year-old genetically engineered demigod who stood over a planet and ordered it cleansed of all life because the circumstances left him no other choice he could live with. But in the context of Warhammer 40,000, where compassion is treated as a tactical weakness, and empathy is something you are more likely to encounter in an enemy than in an ally, Vulcan is a genuinely different kind of being. He cares about ordinary people. He has always cared about ordinary people. He was raised by ordinary people, in a volcanic forge on a death world where the sky glows orange with distant eruptions and the ground shakes without warning. And that upbringing shaped him into something the Emperor's other sons never quite became. And here is the thing that should make every single one of you sit up a little straighter, because it is the point that this entire video builds toward. Vulcan is not confirmed dead. Not in the 41st millennium. Not now, in the current era of the setting, as the Great Rift bleeds its way across the galaxy, and Guilliman marches his Indomitus crusade through a universe that is actively trying to come apart. While the lion awakens from his centuries of sleep in the depths of the rock and adds his voice to the diminishing chorus of returning Primarchs, Vulcan is out there. Somewhere. Missing, yes. Unconfirmed, yes. But missing and a perpetual is not the same thing as dead, and the distinction is not merely technical. A perpetual cannot stay dead. That is the entire point. It is not just that Vulcan is hard to kill, though he absolutely is, being physically the largest and in many ways the most powerful of all 20 Primarchs in raw physical terms. It is that the ability to regenerate from death is built into his cellular biology at a level that goes beyond any conventional healing. He can be reduced to nothing. He can have his molecular structure scattered across a battlefield by a nuclear detonation. He can have the Emperor's own psychic power driven through his heart in crystallized form. And he comes back every time because the universe does not yet have a mechanism that can permanently unmake a perpetual without something even rarer and more specific than anything his enemies have typically brought to the table. Well, we are going to spend a long time today exploring exactly why all of this matters. Because the full story of Vulcan, from his first breath on a volcanic world that should have killed him, through the sustained torture that made the worst things done to other Primarchs look brief by comparison, through his secret vigil during the Siege of Terror, through the War of the Beast, through 10,000 years of shadow and rumor and the quiet burning faith of the Salamanders who carry his name and follow his creed, is one of the most extraordinary stories in all of Warhammer lore. It stretches from one end of the timeline to the other. It involves betrayal and rebirth and sacrifice, and the most patient quest any chapter has ever undertaken. And most people have only heard the first chapter, so let us fix that. Settle in, let the quiet come, and then let us go all the way back to the beginning, to a world made of fire and stone and stubbornness, to a child found by a blacksmith who knew how to give things names that fit them. We are going to Nocturne, and by the time we are done, you will understand exactly why the battle cry, Vulcan Lives, has never been ceremonial. It has always been literal. Part 1. Nocturne, the world that makes you hard. Picture a planet that does not want to be lived on. That is not a metaphor. Nocturne is classified simultaneously as both a feudal world and a death world by the Imperial Administratum, which is already making a statement. Most worlds receive one designation or the other. Death worlds are environments so hostile that survival is constantly in question. Places of extreme weather, lethal fauna, toxic atmospheres, or geological instability that would render any human settlement impermanent at best. Feudal worlds are places where human civilization exists, but has not progressed beyond a medieval or pre-industrial level of development, typically cut off from the broader Imperium's technology for one reason or another. Getting both classifications at once means Nocturne is a place where humans live at a feudal level of technological development, because the environment is so hostile that advanced technology cannot be effectively sustained. You cannot build a reliable power grid when the ground shakes the foundations of your buildings every few months, and volcanic eruptions periodically cover everything in meters of ash. The geological reason for all of this is the moon. Nocturne's moon is called Prometheus, and it is enormous, oversized relative to the planet in a way that creates a gravitational relationship that squeezes and stretches Nocturne's crust as it passes overhead. The result is a planet riddled with fault lines, dotted with vast chains of volcanoes, subject to earthquakes that can last for days, and flows of liquid rock that reshape the landscape in ways no long-term map can account for. The largest volcano, Mount Deathfire, dominates the central continent like a god sitting down in the middle of a landscape too small for it. Its caldera is vast enough to be visible from space on a clear day, though clear days on Nocturne are themselves a rarity given the constant presence of volcanic ash in the upper atmosphere, filtering the sunlight into something orange and diffuse that turns every outdoor moment into a painting made of fire and shadow. The people who live here are not soft. They cannot afford to be. The enormous levels of stellar radiation that penetrate what little atmosphere remains between eruptions have given most of Nocturne's life, its plants, its animals, its people, a dark, obsidian quality. The Nocturnians are a dark-skinned people, dense with muscle, built with the kind of physical resilience that comes from generations of surviving environments that killed everyone lighter. They have adapted not just biologically but culturally to a world that is actively hostile to them, and the result is a culture built around endurance, self-reliance, and the understanding that communities which protect each other survive where individuals who protect only themselves do not. They build underground. The 7 major settlements on Nocturne, the sanctuary cities, exist primarily beneath the surface, carved into the deep rock where the tectonic activity is more predictable and the ash storms cannot reach. Each city is a vast subterranean network of chambers and tunnels and workshops built around the particular resources of its local geology, connected to the surface by armored shafts with blast doors that can be sealed when the volcano nearest to you decides that today is the day it wants to express itself. The people up there have a culture built around fire in every possible way. Fire as light, fire as heat, fire as the forge at the center of their technology, of fire as the central metaphor of their spiritual life. They burn their dead rather than burying them, returning the ash of the departed to the planet itself, the remains drawn back into the stone and fire that made everything on this world. The Promethean cult that is central to Salamander's theology grows directly from this Nocturnian fire worship. the circle of fire, the idea that destruction and rebirth are the same cycle, that what the flame takes, it also gives back in new form. The giant salamanders that give the chapter its name are native to Nocturne. They are real creatures, very large, fire-resistant reptiloids that live primarily on the slopes of Mount Deathfire, in the most hostile zone of the most hostile volcano on an already extremely hostile planet. They can breathe fire, as in the sense that their biochemistry produces flammable gases that they ignite through a specialized organ, though calling what they produce fire undersells it. It is closer to a sustained directed plasma at close range. The largest of them, the fire drakes of Mount Deathfire, are creatures that even the elite terminators of the Salamander's first company, who are literally named the fire drakes in honor of the animals, consider genuinely dangerous opponents. Killing one is the final trial for Salamander's initiates. The survival of the attempt says something about you that lesser tests cannot establish. Think about what that detail communicates about Nocturne as a world, and about the culture that grew from it. The final trial for a Space Marine initiate, a genetically enhanced post-human warrior who has already undergone the full suite of surgical modifications that turn an ordinary human into something beyond ordinary human, is to go alone to the slopes of the most dangerous volcano on a death world and kill a creature that the best warriors in the chapter regard as a serious threat. There is no guarantee of survival. The trial is real. Initiates die attempting it, and the deaths are not treated as failures of the program, but as the result of an accurate calibration of the standard required. If you can pass this trial, you have proven something genuine. If you cannot, you are not ready, and no amount of political goodwill or administrative convenience changes that fact. And this is Nocturne's gift to the chapter that protects it. An absolute refusal to accept pretense. The environment will not pretend to be safer than it is. The creatures will not pretend to be weaker than they are. The ground will not pretend to be stable. And the people who survive in this environment develop a corresponding inability to accept pretense in any form. They are not harsh people. The salamanders and the Nocturnians who produce them are among the warmest of all humanity's warrior cultures, and that warmth is authentic rather than performed. But they are honest. They do not dress failures in ceremonial language, and they do not congratulate themselves for achievements that have not actually been made. If you want to be a salamander, go to the mountain, kill the fire drake, come back. Everything else is just waiting. And into this world, a Primarch fell. The 20 Primarchs were scattered from the Emperor's gene laboratory on Terra by the Chaos Gods before their creation was complete in a social sense, before they could be trained and oriented and prepared for what they were meant to do. They arrived on worlds scattered across the galaxy as infants, because the physics of their creation made that the shape of their landing, and they had to grow into what they were going to become against the backdrop of whatever world they found themselves on. Some landed in environments that recognized their potential and tried to shape it. Some landed among enemies who tried to destroy them before they could realize it. Vulcan landed on Nocturne during what the planet's traditions call the Time of Trial, a periodic period of intensified volcanic activity during which the surface of the world is at its most dramatically hostile. And a blacksmith named Enbel found him and took him in. Enbel was, by the accounts preserved in the Promethean Opus, the Salamander's sacred historical text, an ordinary man in the ways that matter most. Not physically extraordinary, not politically powerful, not wealthy or connected. He was skilled at his craft. He worked iron and steel with the kind of competence that comes from years of patient practice, and he was recognized within his community as someone worth consulting on matters of metalwork. He raised his foundling child with the directness and lack of ceremony that blacksmiths tend to bring to things, as teaching Vulcan the forge before the child's hands were large enough to properly grip the hammer, treating him as an apprentice first and a wonder second. This grounded quality of his upbringing, the daily practical work of shaping metal into useful things, the absence of mythology around his own origins, comes through consistently in how Vulcan is described throughout the lore. He never lost the connection to the forge. No matter what else was happening in his life or his legend, there was always the work, the patient application of heat and hammer and will to raw material. Vulcan grew with the impossible speed that Primarchs always grow at. Within 3 years, 3 short years, shorter than it takes most children to really learn to read, he was physically larger and stronger than any adult male on Nocturne. Within a few months of reaching that stage, he had already absorbed everything Bel could teach him about metalworking and was beginning to develop innovations his adopted father had never conceived of. Techniques for heat treatment that produced alloys of unprecedented toughness. Joining methods that solved problems the Nocturnian forge traditions had been working around for generations. He was advancing the planet's entire technological base, not through any grand gesture, but through the simple act of working in the forge and thinking carefully about what he was doing, and then talking about what he found to the people he worked alongside. And then, characteristically, he began teaching everyone else what he had learned. This detail does not receive enough attention in Vulcan discussions. Yet he could have used his extraordinary capabilities to establish dominance. That is how several of his brothers responded to similar situations. A being of godlike physical capability, surrounded by ordinary humans, has certain obvious options available to him, and consolidating personal power is the most obvious. Vulcan did not do that. He sat down beside the other craftspeople of his settlement and showed them what he had figured out. He gave away his advantages, not because he was naive about what they were, but because improving the forge skills of the community around him was more satisfying than being the only person in it who could work at that level. The quality of what could be made when multiple skilled smiths were working together toward a shared understanding was better than what one exceptional individual could produce alone. But the philosophy of the forge, that tools are more useful when more people can use them, was something he internalized completely. Nocturne had a second problem beyond volcanic eruptions. The world was a regular raiding target for the Drukhari. The Dark Eldar, the ancient species of nightmarish slavers that lives in the hidden city of Komorragh and periodically emerges through webway portals to take captives from worlds across the galaxy. The Nocturnians called them Dusk Wraiths. They had adapted to these raids over generations the way people adapt to recurring catastrophes. Each person had a hiding place, a personal burrow, or cellar, or nook, prepared for the moment the Dusk Wraiths came. It was survival wisdom, codified into behavior that at least reduced the harm. Vulcan did not comply with it. But when the Drukhari came during his 4th year on Nocturne, 4 years old in Primarch reckoning, physically an adult already, carrying a smith's knowledge and combat instincts that existed fully formed, Vulcan walked out into the center of the settlement. He stood in the open air. He crossed his 2 smithing hammers over his shoulders and looked at the raiders who had come to take his people. He did not move, and the people came out of hiding. Something in the quality of his defiance was contagious. He was not simply refusing to hide, which any individual could do pointlessly. He was standing there as if the raiders were a problem he was about to solve, as if his presence changed the terms of the encounter, as if hiding were not merely inadvisable, but simply not what was happening today. The people felt it, and they came out, and they fought. With a Primarch coordinating the defense, the outcome was not in question. Vulcan alone killed 100 Drukhari that day, with blacksmiths' hammers, in a defense that was at once furious and controlled, focused entirely on protecting his people, rather than on the violence for its own sake. Within weeks, the leaders of all 7 sanctuary cities had traveled to find Vulcan, because a victory over the Dusk Wraiths of that completeness had never happened in anyone's living memory. They swore, collectively, never to hide again. That oath is still part of Nocturnian culture. It is preserved in the Promethean cult, and in the Salamander's own traditions, as one of the founding moments of what the people of Nocturne are. They were a people who hid from their predators. Or Vulcan showed them what it looked like when someone decided that being taken was not acceptable and the decision was contagious. Mount Deathfire, standing at the center of the planet's volcanic geography, became progressively more significant in the story of who Vulcan was. The volcano is sacred for reasons that go beyond its imposing physical presence. Its caves and tunnels and chambers form a labyrinthine underworld that no map has ever completely described. The lore suggests only Vulcan himself ever fully navigated it, leaving mysterious sealed chambers deep within that have never been opened by anyone since. When salamanders initiates face their final trial, they come to Mount Deathfire. When the dead are returned to the planet, they are processed in the Imperium, the sacred crematorium within the volcano's structure. When Vulcan's body was eventually returned to Nocturne after the disaster of the Horus Heresy, it was to the heart of Mount Deathfire that it was taken. The volcano is not merely symbolic to the salamanders, it is the place where their relationship with their Primarch is most physically real. Part 2. The 8-day contest and what the Emperor said. The story of how Vulcan met the Emperor reads like a folktale that is also a philosophy lesson, and it is both of those things at once. A great tournament was organized on Nocturne to celebrate the people's growing strength and unity. The tournament would encompass the things Nocturne valued most: strength, endurance, intelligence, and craft. And it was meant to be a moment of collective pride, a declaration of identity through competition. And then, unexpectedly, a stranger arrived in the middle of the festivities. He was pale-complexioned, oddly dressed, carrying an air that the Promethean opus describes in terms that translate roughly as comfortable with being underestimated. He announced he could best anyone present in any contest, and the assembled Nocturnians laughed because the claim was absurd. Vulcan was standing right there. Who could compete with Vulcan? The wager was simple and absolute. Whoever lost would forever serve the victor. 8 days of competition followed across every domain Nocturne considered worth testing. Strength, endurance, intellectual challenges that tested breadth and speed of reasoning. Forge competitions where the quality of what could be made from raw material under time pressure was the measure of excellence. And the stranger kept pace with Vulcan through all of it. By the final challenge, both men had proven extraordinary, and the last test was this: travel to Mount Deathfire, hunt and kill one of the great salamander fire drakes, and return with proof. Both men set out. Both men found and killed their salamanders, but the stranger came back late and empty-handed. On the slopes of Mount Deathfire, he had encountered villagers in desperate need, and he had sacrificed his kill to help them. Given up the proof of his victory to save lives he had no formal obligation to save. Vulcan had won by the formal terms of the contest. He set down his own kill and went to one knee. Because a man who values another person's life over his own victory is the right kind of person to follow. Not because strength compels it, but because wisdom chooses it. And then the stranger let the disguise fall, and the full impossible presence of the Emperor of Mankind stood on the volcanic slopes of Nocturne. The conversations that followed are preserved in the opus, and there is one passage that deserves particular attention. When Vulcan asked what he could possibly teach his Primarch brothers, all of them already proven as generals and conquerors, the Emperor said something that none of the other Primarchs received quite so plainly. He said Vulcan's lesson was the most important one. He said Vulcan was utterly unlike the rest of his sons, and that this difference, this humanity, this orientation toward care and protection, and the recognition of individual worth in ordinary lives, was not a compromise of his purpose but the core of it. Among all 20 of the Emperor's creations, yet the achievement he said he was most proud of was not the warrior or the conqueror or the brilliant administrator. It was the Primarch who remembered what people were worth because he had lived among them as one of them. Whether the Imperium ever truly received that lesson is one of the setting's most sustained tragedies. There is something else worth sitting with about this encounter, something that gets overlooked, because the revelation of the Emperor tends to dominate discussion of the scene. The stranger, whoever he appeared to be, whatever disguise the Master of Mankind had adopted for this test, did not hesitate when he reached the choice between the hunt and the villagers. He did not calculate. He did not spend time working through the strategic value of one outcome against the other. He simply stopped what he was doing and helped people in need, at cost to himself, without any apparent expectation that the cost would be acknowledged or rewarded. This is the thing that made Vulcan kneel. Not power, not wisdom in the abstract, not some demonstration of superiority that left Vulcan with no better option. The stranger showed him someone who had the opportunity to win at the cost of letting people suffer, and chose to let other people win instead. And Vulcan recognized in that choice the exact quality he had been living since Enbel's forge. The understanding that winning at the cost of the people you are supposed to protect is not winning. It is just a more elaborate form of losing. The Emperor knew his son. He designed the test for the specific shape of what Vulcan valued, because he knew what Vulcan was. And Vulcan's response to it, the willingness to kneel to someone who would sacrifice victory to save strangers, tells you that the Emperor got it right. He understood what his son most deeply respected. And in that moment of recognition, the Primarch on one knee, the Emperor letting the disguise fall, the volcanic slopes of Nocturne quiet around them, you have perhaps the most genuine meeting between any Primarch and their father in the entire lore. No deception, no political calculation, just the right kind of person recognizing the right kind of person. Vulcan was given command of the 18th Legion, which had been created from his gene seed and had been operating as the Dragon Warriors while waiting for their Primarch. The name was changed to the Salamanders, in honor of Nocturne and the contest that had reunited Vulcan with his father. From that moment, the Salamanders began to develop the character that would define them across 10,000 years of history, a character built around protecting civilians, preserving human life, and refusing to treat ordinary people as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of military objectives. By Space Marine standards, this was remarkable. By the standards of Warhammer 40,000 in general, where the Imperium's relationship to the people supposedly under its protection resembles a farmer's relationship to his livestock, it was almost revolutionary. The Salamanders' approach to warfare during the Great Crusade was never weak. These were warriors who trained in conditions that would kill unenhanced humans without any enemy involvement, who carried weapons made by the finest craftsman Primarch the Imperium would ever produce. But they were selective in their use of force, in a way that many of their brothers were not. They asked whether a destruction was necessary before it was ordered. They weighed civilian presence in their calculations. They rebuilt after compliance rather than moving on immediately, because they understood that a population left in smoking ruins would not produce the stable, contributing imperial worlds that the Crusade was theoretically building toward. Their success rates were excellent. They achieved the objectives they were given. They just achieved them without the secondary disaster of treating every compliance as a license to practice maximum violence at scale. In a Legion culture, the Primarch's philosophy becomes the chapter's philosophy. Yet the Salamanders internalized Vulcan's orientation because Vulcan himself modeled it, not as a policy to be quoted, but as a practice to be inhabited. When he went into the forge at the end of a campaign and spent days making something with his hands, the artisans and tech marines, and even the warriors of the Legion, gathered to watch or to assist. When he took the time to learn the names of the civilians on a world they had just brought into compliance, the sergeants and captains noticed. When he chose the harder route that preserved lives over the faster route that treated lives as acceptable costs, the culture of the Legion shifted toward that choice as the default rather than the exception. That culture survived 10,000 years of his absence. That is, if you think about what it says about the quality of what Vulcan built. Oh, an extraordinary thing. Part 3. The craftsman at War Vulcan's identity during the Great Crusade was never simply military. Of course he was a warrior. He was physically the largest of all the Primarchs, a detail the lore establishes multiple times, making him the strongest in raw physical terms, even before you account for a perpetual supernatural cellular resilience. He was an enormously capable battlefield commander, whose understanding of strategy and tactics was sharp enough to win complex engagements against species and opponents that most commanders would have found deeply difficult. The Salamanders under his leadership were formidable in ways that made their relative restraint more impressive, not less. You have to be very capable to be selectively restrained without losing, and the salamanders always won. But the thing Vulcan was most famous for, the thing that shaped his reputation in ways that combat victories never quite matched, was his craftsmanship. He made things with his hands, the most extraordinary things, weapons and armor and devices that combined the highest expression of the Mechanicum's technical knowledge with something that pure engineering science could not entirely account for. The quality of objects made by someone who understood both the material and the purpose with perfect clarity, who was not just following design specifications, but genuinely imagining what the thing he was building would protect, or enable, or express. The forge aboard the Salamander's flagship was as sacred a space as the Strategium or the Chapel of Remembrance. Vulcan spent hours there between campaigns, often days at a stretch, though working at a personal station that he had designed and built himself. The sound of his hammer was something the whole ship knew. That particular rhythm, the weight of each strike, the pauses for assessment between sequences of blows that told a listener which phase of the work was in progress. The salamanders said the ship itself calmed when he was forging. The machine spirits settled. The great engines found a quieter frequency. Whether that was genuinely true in a literal sense, or simply the psychological observation that a crew functions differently when they know their Primarch is doing something productive rather than standing on the bridge waiting for enemies to arrive, the experience itself was consistent enough that the lore preserves it as fact. He forged weapons for his brothers, yet he built devices whose names have become part of the setting's mythology across 10,000 years. And the work itself was not separate from his understanding of his role. To build something well was, for Vulcan, an act of philosophy as much as an act of craft. Every weapon he made was a statement about what strength was for. Every piece of armor was a promise that the person wearing it would come home. The care he took in making things was the same care he took in protecting people, and the connection between the two was not metaphorical to him. It was literal. The forge and the battlefield were the same expression of the same underlying value, that the things worth having are worth building carefully and worth defending fiercely. Dawnbringer, the great warhammer that he eventually carried to Istvan V, it was originally forged as a gift for Horus. Think about what that means. Vulcan spent what would have been significant time, even for him, creating a weapon of extraordinary power intended as an expression of brotherhood between himself and the War Master. He made it with the specific quality of Horus in mind, what a weapon for Horus ought to be, what it should say about its bearer and the relationship between them. And then something changed. At some point before the Istvan campaign, Vulcan decided not to give it to Horus. The lore is not precise about when he made this decision or what specifically crystallized it, but the implication is that his instincts, the same instincts that had made him uncomfortable during the Karatan compliance, that had heard something wrong in Horus's response to Kurz's massacre, told him that putting that particular weapon in Horus's hands was not right, so he kept it. He brought it with him to the day the galaxy broke, and he swung it against the very forces that Horus had already pledged himself to. That is the detail that tells you Vulcan understood something about the heresy before most of his brothers did. He did not shout about it. He did not go to Gilliman, or the Lion, or Rogel Dawn and make the case. He made a quiet, private decision based on a feeling he trusted, and that feeling was right, and the hammer he kept by his own side rather than giving away was the hammer he used when the moment of betrayal finally arrived. The Salamanders developed under this influence into something unusual among the Space Marine legions. They gained a reputation across the Great Crusade for taking particular care during compliance operations to ensure that populations being brought into the Imperium were protected rather than simply conquered. They pushed back against orders that would have produced faster military results at higher civilian cost. In a setting where that kind of consideration was not universal, was in fact frequently regarded as naivety by Primarchs with different philosophies, the Salamanders stood out. The relationship between Vulcan and Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter, deserves careful attention here. because it will become the most important relationship in Vulcan's story for the next phase of his life. The two were assigned to operate together in the Karaatan system, with Horus apparently believing that Vulcan's steadying influence might have some effect on the Night Lord Primarch's more extreme tendencies. It did not work out that way. The Night Lords massacred an entire city during the compliance operation, not because it was tactically necessary, but because terror was Kurz's primary language, and he had concluded that a sufficient demonstration of what he was capable of would end resistance faster. He was right, in the narrow tactical sense, but Vulcan was horrified, and he went to Horus to say so. What he received in response was mockery. Horus thanked him sarcastically for making Kurzi into a more effective weapon. The encounter left Vulcan deeply unsettled, not just about Kurzi, but about Horus. There was something in that response that went beyond ordinary callousness, something that suggested Horus was already in a place where Vulcan's values looked like weaknesses to be deployed against him, rather than perspectives to be genuinely considered. It was partly this unease that led Vulcan, in the days before Istvan Farth, to make the decision to destroy most of his greatest creations. He had forged weapons of extraordinary power throughout the Great Crusade, and he had come to understand that power in the hands of those without the restraint to use it wisely was just catastrophe in expensive packaging. He went to his forgemaster Tekel and told him to destroy the vault. Tekel pleaded for the works to be preserved as Vulcan's legacy. They reached a compromise. 7 artifacts would be chosen and kept, preserved by Tekel, hidden if Vulcan did not return from what was coming. The rest would be destroyed, and Tekel would be bound to Nocturne, unable to travel to Istvan Firm, tasked with holding the legacy against the future. The weight of that decision, Vulcan standing in his vault, looking at the work of decades, the finest things he had ever made, and ordering most of it destroyed rather than allowing it to fall into the wrong hands, is not a small thing. It is a Primarch choosing the future's safety over his own legacy. It is the Forge philosophy applied at its most personal cost. Some things are more important than preserving what you have made, and knowing when to let go of the creation is part of understanding what creation is for. The Warhammer Dawnbringer, which Vulcan had originally forged as a gift for Horus, before sensing something wrong in his brother and deciding to keep it, went with him to Istvan Fi, where he carried it on the day everything changed. Part 4. The Drop Site Massacre. The day the galaxy broke. The name Istvan Fav carries a weight in Warhammer 40,000 that is difficult to fully convey to someone encountering it for the first time. It is a specific geographic location, but it has become something more than a place. It is the word for the moment when the Horus heresy stopped being a rebellion and became a catastrophe already in motion. It is the word for organized, premeditated betrayal at the scale of interstellar warfare. And for Vulcan, personally, it was the beginning of something that should have been the end of him. The plan that Rogel Dawn and Malkador had constructed sent 7 legions to Istvan V in a 2-wave assault. The first wave, Iron Hands under Ferrus Manus, Raven Guard under Corvus Corax, and Salamanders under Vulcan, would land and engage the traitor forces already present. The second wave of 4 legions would land as reinforcement once the battle was joined. The second wave had already pledged themselves to Horus. The Night Lords, the Iron Warriors, the Word Bearers, and the Alpha Legion landed behind the Loyalists and opened fire. 3 legions, caught between 2 walls of enemies with no retreat and no escape route that was not already covered, fought what became known as the Drop Site Massacre. It was not a battle in any traditional sense. It was systematic extermination. To understand the full horror of what happened on those black sand plains, you need to understand the scale. 3 Space Marine legions, tens of thousands of warriors, are some of the finest soldiers the galaxy had ever produced, not fighting their way through a disadvantageous situation
Okay, I want to step outside the lore for just a second because I think Vulcan is genuinely one of the most underrated Primarchs in the entire setting, and I say that as someone who has spent an unreasonable amount of time thinking about this. What gets me about him is that his whole deal is not about being the strongest, or the smartest, or the most strategically gifted. It is about caring, genuinely, stubbornly, at enormous personal cost, caring about the people standing in front of him. And in a setting defined by grimdark and despair and treating individual lives as infinitely expandable, that is almost radical. He's the one Primarch who would stop and learn your name. And I think that matters way more than people give it credit for. But anyways, that's just my 2 cents. Let's go back to the video.
Not retreating under fire, but caught in a prepared killing ground by forces they had believed were allies. The Iron Hands took the worst of it in the early moments when Ferrus Manus drove forward toward the traitors and Fulgrim ended him on the field. The Raven Guard, by nature inclined to shadow and concealment, found ways to scatter into the terrain and begin a guerrilla resistance that would last for months. The Salamanders held their ground and fought in the Salamanders' way, protecting each other, pulling back wounded, refusing to leave their dead. This was both noble and costly. You cannot cover a retreat for everyone and also complete a retreat yourself. And the Salamanders' unwillingness to abandon their brothers meant they were consistently among the last to reach any defensible position, consistently in the most exposed situation. They held. They fought with extraordinary discipline given the circumstances. But the mathematics of the situation were absolute and did not respond to discipline, and the Salamanders were ground down until what remained was a final surrounded position, and the Iron Warriors made the clinical decision that this particular expenditure of time and ammunition could be ended efficiently. The missiles hit. The detonation was catastrophic. Everyone in the blast zone died. Everyone except Vulcan. He did not know why. He lay amid the smoking ruin of his sons, breathing air that tasted of fire and radiation, and he did not understand what had just happened. There, he had been in the center of a nuclear detonation. He should have been vapor. He was not. And the Night Lords moving through the massacre recognized the unconscious Primarch of the Salamanders and sent word to Conrad Kurz, who took Vulcan prisoner rather than killing him where he lay. Kurz had been watching his brother all through the Karatan compliance. He had watched Vulcan's disgust at his methods. He had listened to Vulcan go to Horus and make the moral case against Terra as a tool. He had spent years considering what it meant that a Primarch as capable as Vulcan had chosen the philosophy he had chosen, and had developed a dark obsession with the question of whether that philosophy was genuine or merely a performance. If darkness was universal, and Kurzi was certain that it was, then Vulcan was either lying to himself about his own nature, or Kurzi was wrong about everything. Kurzi could not accept being wrong about everything. So he had concluded that Vulcan must be made to admit the truth. This was the beginning of months of something that should not have been survivable. Kurzi spent those months trying to kill Vulcan, over and over, in as many different ways as he could devise, limited only by his own considerable dark imagination. He cut Vulcan's head off. He ripped his throat out with a corroded fork. He had Vulcan shot with hundreds of bolters at point-blank range, a concentrated execution by entire squads. He had him eviscerated. He left him in the venting shaft of a starship engine. He threw him naked into the void of space. He drowned him. Well, he burned him. He built an elaborate iron labyrinth in the bowels of his flagship, the Nightfall, designed by the sadistic architectural genius of Perturabo, filled with death traps and impossible choices, with Dawnbringer placed at the center as bait, because Kurzi understood that even hope could be made into a weapon against someone. And every single time, Vulcan came back. He woke up in a new cell. He felt his body reconstitute from the damage that should have been the end of him. He opened his eyes and was alive, and Kurzi was waiting, and the cycle began again. He did not understand it at first. The first few resurrections were incomprehensible, a kind of madness that he could not orient himself within. But gradually, Through the accumulation of impossible experience, Vulcan came to understand what he was. He was a perpetual. He shared something with his father, the Emperor of mankind, a cellular regeneration so complete that death itself was not the end of him. But Kersey was not interested only in the killing. He was trying to prove something. He had built his entire worldview around the thesis that darkness is universal, that beneath every person's civilization and empathy and claimed virtue is the same capacity for violence and cruelty that defined the Night Haunter. He wanted Vulcan to admit that beneath the compassion and the philosophy of protection, beneath all the genuine care for ordinary people that defined the Lord of Drakes, was the same killer that lived in Kersey himself. He killed Vulcan over and over to force this admission. He put Vulcan in situations where the only way to survive was to harm others. Using elaborate mechanisms to make Vulcan complicit in deaths he did not choose. He argued. He presented the philosophical case. He used every method available to a being of his dark intelligence to convince Vulcan that they were fundamentally the same kind of thing. The philosophical argument Kersey made, in between the torture and the killing, was not stupid. That is the uncomfortable thing about the Night Haunter as a character. He was genuinely intelligent, genuinely insightful in a narrow and dark way, and the case he made to Vulcan was coherent. You value human life, he said, but you have killed more humans than almost any other being alive. You protect your own people, but protecting your own people means destroying other people's lives, other people's worlds, other people's children. Yet the Great Crusade's compliance operations had death tolls in every engagement. The galaxy Vulcan helped build was built on bones just like every other galaxy. The only difference between Vulcan and Kersey, the Night Haunter argued, was that Vulcan dressed his violence in nicer philosophy and then pretended not to see what the philosophy was covering. Vulcan's response to this argument, over months of torture and debate, was not a clean counter-argument. He was not writing a philosophy paper in between resurrections, he was holding on. The response was not intellectual, it was existential. The continued insistence at the cellular level of who he was, that what he cared about was real and worth caring about regardless of what it cost him, regardless of what Kers was doing to him, regardless of how compelling the logic of despair became when you were waking up in your own blood for the 40th time. He did not break. Through months of this, through deaths beyond counting, Vulcan held on to himself, not without cost. His sanity was being steadily eroded by the experience, and there were periods where the damage was deep enough to seriously affect his coherent function. But the fundamental thread of who he was did not break. The orientation toward protection and craft, and the dignity of ordinary life that had been woven into him by Nocturne and Enbel's forge. It bent under Kers's relentless pressure. It frayed at the edges, but it did not break. And Kers, who had constructed his whole philosophy around the idea that darkness was universal, could not make it break in the one person he most needed it to. As Part 5, The Escape, the Fulgurite, and the Unbound Flame. Corvus Corax found him, the Raven Guard Primarch who had survived Istvan V by more margin than Vulcan, but had still lost most of his legion in the massacre, mounted a rescue operation into the depths of Kers's flagship. By this point, Vulcan was so damaged by the accumulated experience of repeated death and resurrection that the rescue had to be conducted by stealth. A Vulcan in full capacity would not have required saving, but the months of torment had left him in a state somewhere between functionally operational and genuinely impaired. Corax extracted him through a running battle that ended with Vulcan falling through the atmosphere of the Ultramarines' homeworld of Macragge, his body burning through re-entry and reconstituting itself on the way down. But he hit the surface alive, barely, but alive, and Kersey followed him there, because the Night Haunter was not finished. The conflict on Macragge drew in Reboot Gilliman and Lion L. Johnson alongside Corax and Vulcan, and eventually involved the human perpetual John Grammaticus, operating on behalf of an alien organization called the Cabal. The Cabal's calculated models of the future had led them to a conclusion that was appalling, but internally consistent. A loyalist victory in the heresy simply delayed the inevitable, because the Chaos powers would keep trying until they eventually succeeded. The only way to end the long war was to let Horus win now, while the Chaos Gods were not yet fully invested, when their gorged triumph would paradoxically weaken them to help Horus win. Yet they needed to remove the Emperor's most powerful remaining mobile asset, a perpetual Primarch who could not be permanently killed. The weapon they had found was the Fulgurite, a piece of glass formed when the Emperor had once channeled an enormous psychic force into the earth during an ancient conflict against chaos. The Fulgurite was a crystallized fragment of the Emperor's own essence, and it was said to be capable of killing a perpetual in a way that would not regenerate. The Cabal instructed Grammaticus to give it to Curzi. Their reasoning was that only a Primarch could properly kill another Primarch. Grammaticus refused. Eldrad Ulthran, the Elder Seer, appeared to him and offered a different path. If Grammaticus himself stabbed Vulcan with the Fulgurite, the psychic interaction would be different from what a Primarch's blow would create. It would kill Vulcan, yes, but in the exchange, it would also restore his shattered mind, clearing the accumulated damage of the torture from his consciousness, giving the galaxy back a functional Primarch rather than a broken one. The cost to Grammaticus was everything. His own perpetual nature would be spent in the act, making his next death his final one. He chose Eldrad's version over the Cabal's. He stabbed Vulcan through the heart. The Fulgurite buried itself in the Primarch's chest, and the resulting psychic detonation killed them both. Grammaticus regenerated one last time, knowing the emptiness of that final regeneration meant there would not be another. Vulcan did not regenerate. He lay dead on Macragge, with the Emperor's crystallized power lodged in his heart, and even the combined strength of Gilliman, Sanguinius, and Lion L. Johnson could not remove it. Gilliman built the stasis capsule with his own hands. He inscribed it with 2 words, Unbound Flame. He insisted it was not a coffin. He said he believed Vulcan would return. The salamanders, who had survived to reach Macragge, stood vigil over the capsule. In the quiet between battles, they thought they could hear a heartbeat. The unbound flame eventually made its way to Nocturne, carried by Artellus Numion, the commander of Vulcan's Pyre Guard, who had survived Istvan Fife and could not accept the finality of the coffin interpretation. Numion navigated the chaos of the ongoing heresy, fought through Death Guard forces that had invaded Nocturne itself, and brought his Primarch home to the one place where it needed to be, the sacred chambers beneath Mount Deathfire. The fire answered. The Fulgurite wound was gone. Vulcan woke in the darkness beneath the volcano, his mind clear in the way that things become clear after being scoured by fire, speaking with a figure he perceived as the embodiment of Deathfire itself, the volcano personified, a spirit of the mountain. Guided by this presence, he found 2 objects he had no memory of making, the thunder hammer Ur-Draculi, and a device whose true purpose would only be revealed later, the talisman of 7 hammers. The price of the resurrection was Numion. Something was given so that something could return. The Promethean Creed's teaching that fire demands sacrifice is not decorative, but the man who had refused to let his Primarch be dead had spent his own life to make it true. And Vulcan woke to find that the greatest act of loyalty any of his sons had ever performed was the act that he was too late to prevent. The journey to Terra that followed was long and strange. He traveled through the webway with Eldrad Ulthran's assistance, fought through a satellite realm of Komorach, joined forces briefly with Shadrach Meduson's guerrilla fleet, and eventually emerged into the Imperial dungeon, the deep chambers of the Imperial Palace, where the Golden Throne waited, where the Emperor himself was increasingly bound by the demands of the device that kept the warp at bay. And the Emperor told Vulcan what the talisman of 7 hammers was truly for. It was a dead man's switch. If Horus won, if the Emperor fell, Vulcan was to activate it, and it would incinerate Terra. Every person, every structure, the Golden Throne itself, burned to nothing so that whatever won could not use what the Emperor had built as the foundation for what came next. Vulcan was horrified. He was a man who had spent his entire existence in defense of ordinary human life. and he was being asked to destroy the most densely populated world in the Imperium in a denial operation. But the Emperor's logic was as vast and cold as always. The alternative was a chaos-corrupted terror and everything that would follow from it across the millennia. A clean death was preferable to an infinitely worse alternative. Vulcan installed the talisman in the Golden Throne. He took up position at the Eternity Gate. He waited for whatever came next. So Part 6, The Siege of Terror, The Guardian. Nobody knew. Most histories of the Siege of Terror do not feature Vulcan prominently. His role was kept secret, the knowledge of his presence restricted to very few. If the broader loyalist forces had known a Primarch was present inside the Imperial Palace, the enemy's intelligence networks would have reacted. Plans that could not afford adjustment would have been compromised. So Vulcan fought in the shadows, handling threats the official record does not always fully describe. The Imperial Palace during the siege was not merely a military fortification under bombardment. It was a spiritual battleground. The accumulated psychic defenses of the Emperor's work over millennia were being tested by everything the traitor legions and their patron gods could bring to bear. As demons found gaps in the wards, the warp bled through in places where faith had wavered or blood had been spilled in sufficient quantity to create a resonance. The palace's defenders were fighting a war on two levels simultaneously. The physical level of bolt and blade at the gates and on the walls, and the metaphysical level of wards and seals, and the contained psychic pressure of 10,000 years of accumulated power, trying not to detonate under the strain of what was being asked of it. Vulcan moved through the palace's interior in this second war more than the first. He was not at the Eternity Gate in the way that Rogel Dawn was at the Eternity Gate, visible and central and commanding the surface defense. He was below, while in the deep corridors and the dungeon levels where the enemies that reached the interior were the ones that ordinary defenses had not stopped. The things that got past the walls by methods other than brute force. He was the last line. The largest of these was Magnus the Red. The Crimson King arrived at the Imperial dungeon with his 1,000 sons, having committed fully to chaos after the burning of Prospero and the subsequent years of escalating choices that had taken him further and further from what he had been. His purpose was direct and total. Reach the Emperor on the Golden Throne and kill him there, ending the war in a single action. He had virtually unlimited psychic power, one of the most gifted psychers the galaxy had ever produced. Imperium transformed into a demon Primarch whose capabilities went beyond what he had been even at his greatest. Vulcan was between him and the Emperor. What followed was a duel of a very specific kind. Magnus could kill Vulcan. He did kill Vulcan multiple times, working through approaches that ranged from the direct to the exotic. He beheaded him with his great curved sword. He transformed Vulcan's lungs to amber, suffocating him from the inside. He drained him of blood and tried to burn him with psychic fire that targets the soul rather than the flesh. He tried everything in the extraordinary range of what a demon Primarch, who has traded everything for sorcerous power, can do. None of it worked. Each death bought a few moments. Each time, Vulcan came back and hit Magnus again. The quality of this duel is worth dwelling on. One, because it is not a typical confrontation in the lore. Two Primarchs fighting is usually about who hits harder or moves faster or has the better tactical instinct. This was something else. Magnus was unquestionably the more powerful combatant in any conventional sense. He was a fully committed demon Primarch with the resources of a Chaos God's investment behind him. Vulcan was a perpetual Primarch, physically enormous and skilled, but operating without the kind of supernatural augmentation Magnus was drawing on. In a fight where the measure was damage output, Magnus won every single exchange. He killed Vulcan every time he tried. He was not failing to kill him. He was killing him successfully and repeatedly. What he could not do was make death stick, and the accumulation of all his successfully lethal strikes into a failed campaign was a drain on his resources that he had not planned for and could not compensate for mid-engagement. The effect of this accumulated over the engagement, was the depletion of Magnus. Psychic power is immense, but finite in any given engagement, and the quantity that Magnus spent trying to permanently kill Vulcan was quantity he could not use to reach the Emperor. While they fought, the palace's own deep wards, anti-demonic defenses laid down by the Emperor during the original construction, built toward the threshold needed to expel demonic entities from the sanctum. Magnus kept spending power. Vulcan kept standing back up. Eventually, the wards fired. Magnus and his 1,000 sons were expelled from the dungeon in a burst of golden light. Yet the assault on the Emperor had failed. Vulcan stood up from his latest death and prepared for whatever came next. What came next was the siege's endgame. Horus lowering the void shields of his flagship. The Emperor boarding the vengeful spirit with Sanguinius and Rogel Dawn to face the Warmaster directly. The series of events that ended with Horus dead, the Emperor broken beyond any ordinary healing, and the Loyalist forces carrying their father's shattered body back to the Golden Throne that would become his permanent vigil. Vulcan stood at the Talisman of 7 Hammers throughout all of it. His Drakesward companion, Atok Abidemi, stood beside him. The traitor forces were hammering at the outer walls of the palace as the siege reached its final phase, sensing the vulnerability of the moment. At the Emperor away from the throne and the psychic defenses diminished. The doors to the throne room were cracking. The noise beyond was everything that had been kept out for months, finding its moment. His hand was on the device that would burn the world. He was close to pressing it. Close enough that Abidemi wept beside him, because they both understood what they were being asked to do and why it was right. And the weight of those two truths together was almost impossible to carry. And then, Acte's voice came across every frequency in the palace. The Emperor still lived. Horus was dead. The vengeful spirit was breaking apart in orbit. The talisman was not activated. Terror burned, but not that way. The relief of that moment is something the text conveys, but does not linger on, because the siege's aftermath left no time for lingering. And Vulcan had stood with his hand on a device that would have killed billions and watched the seconds pass and prepared himself to use it. And he had not had to. The fact that he was genuinely prepared to use it, that this was not a bluff or a failure of will but a real decision made by a being whose entire philosophy was oriented toward protecting human life, is one of the most striking things the Siege of Terror source material establishes about who Vulcan was by this point. He had been broken by Kurz and rebuilt by Nocturne and guided by the Emperor to this moment, and he had carried the weight of the dead man's switch from the point of installation to the moment it became unnecessary, and he had not dropped it. That is extraordinary. The man who hid the children of Nocturne behind his body when the Drukhari came, as the man who stood on his knee before a stranger who helped people at cost to himself, the man who spent decades making objects of beauty because beauty was worth making. That man had accepted the possibility of burning the most populated world in human civilization because he understood what the alternative was. The comprehensiveness of that acceptance is the measure of what the heresy cost him. Part 7. After the heresy, the departure and the 9 tests. The years immediately following the Siege of Terror are not well documented in the Salamander's case. Vulcan was present for the second founding, when Guilliman drafted the Codex Astartes, and the legions were reorganized into smaller, more numerous chapters. As he had reservations about the reform, he was among those who believed the military efficiency of large united legions was something the Imperium genuinely needed and would miss in crises to come. But he accepted the decision, because unity in the aftermath of the heresy was more important than winning the argument, and because his nature was always one of building rather than fighting about the architecture of what had been built. And then, roughly 1,000 years after the siege, he left. The preparations he made before departing tell you a great deal about how he thought. He scattered 9 artifacts, the 7 that Tekel had preserved from the vault, plus 2 additional pieces that had survived the heresy with him, across the galaxy. He left the Tome of Fire, his collection of writings and encoded knowledge, as both a resource and a map, whose decoding would require understanding how he thought rather than simply reading what he wrote. He created the institution of the Forge Father, a warrior chosen from the chapter's leadership who gives up their name and identity to become Vulcan, dedicating everything to the quest. And he left the message that would define the Salamander's entire identity for the next 10,000 years. Find all 9 artifacts, bring them to Nocturne, and then he would judge his sons worthy, and he would return. This choice is worth examining carefully. Vulcan could have stayed. He was alive and effective, and the Imperium he had helped defend was in its most vulnerable period. The presence of an active perpetual Primarch would have been genuinely valuable. He left anyway. And the nature of the test he set suggests his reasons were connected to the specific qualities he most valued. Finding 9 artifacts scattered across the galaxy, using only encrypted clues in a sacred text, written in the particular idiom of a mind you have to understand from the inside to decode, across a timeline that would inevitably span generations of individual Forge Fathers. This is not a test of military capability. It is not a test of strategic genius. It is a test of whether the Salamanders could hold their values in the sustained absence of the person who embodied them. It is the question of whether what Vulcan had built was genuinely part of who his sons were, or merely a performance sustained by his presence. The 7 artifacts that Tekel chose to preserve were named in the lore as the Unbound Flame, the Obsidian Chariot, the Spear of Vulcan, the Song of Entropy, the Chalice of Fire, the Great Forge Ship that produced the Salamander's military equipment, the Eye of Vulcan, a system of orbiting defense lasers, and the Engine of Woes. The 2 additional artifacts, Casare's Mantle and the Gauntlet of the Forge, were carried by Vulcan through the heresy and eventually scattered with the rest. 9 in total, 9 tests, 9 keys to his return. The institution of the Forge Father is one of the stranger pieces of institutional design in the setting, and it is deeply characteristic of how Vulcan thought about legacy and identity. The warrior chosen to become Forge Father gives up their name, their company, their individual history. They become Vulcan, in the specific and particular sense of dedicating everything they are to the quest the Primarch left behind. It is an act of deliberate self-erasure in service of something larger than the individual, which is itself the Promethean creed in institutional form. By the time we reach the current era, 5 of the 9 artifacts have been recovered by previous Forge Fathers across the millennia. The current Forge Father, Vulcan Hestan, once the captain of the 4th Company, carries 3 of the 5 recovered pieces personally. Casare's Mantle, the legendary drakeskin cloak made from the fire drake the Emperor slew during the Great Contest on Nocturne. The Spear of Vulcan, the power weapon that sets ceramite burning with its incandescent blade. And the Gauntlet of the Forge, with its ancient heavy flamer that has burned in battle for 10,000 years. Hestan has spent decades following the Tome of Fire's encrypted passages from system to system, calling on the full resources of the chapter when the trail requires it, fighting his way through whatever currently occupies the locations where the clues lead. He is described in Codex sources as one of the most accomplished warriors in the current Salamander's chapter, which means something given the standard of people the chapter produces. He is also the target of Trazyn the Infinite's acquisitive attention. The Necron Collector of Solium Nes has made 2 separate attempts to steal the Spear of Vulcan from Hestan, which says something about how the most compulsive collector in the galaxy evaluates the Vulcan legacy. The persistent fan theory that Trazyn has Vulcan himself stashed in stasis somewhere in his vaults has no canonical confirmation, but has never been ruled out, which in Warhammer lore is practically an invitation to keep speculating. Part 8. The War of the Beast. He was never truly gone. 1,500 years after the Horus Heresy, in the 32nd Millennium, the Imperium faces its greatest challenge since the Siege of Terra, the War of the Beast. 12 novels, a year-long Black Library event series depicting the emergence of an Orc empire that has not been seen since the Great Crusade. The Beast, the supreme Orc warlord of this era, is not an ordinary opponent. He stands 10 meters tall. He speaks perfect High Gothic, which is one of the most deeply unsettling details in the entire conflict, because it establishes that this is not a simple orc mob operating on raw aggression. This is something else. It's something organized and strategic and intelligent in ways that orcs simply are not supposed to be capable of. He has constructed attack moons, planetoid-scale weapons platforms that can teleport through space, and has positioned one directly over Terra, inside the Imperium's most protected space, as a demonstration that there is nowhere the Imperium's defenders can stand and feel safe. The scale of what the beast represents is worth spending a moment on. The orc species is the most widespread military threat in the galaxy by most estimates, present on worlds across every region of space, capable of fielding armies that number in the hundreds of millions when the circumstances allow, and essentially impossible to destroy permanently because their spores contaminate worlds they have occupied and produce new orcs without any planning or direction from their supposed commanders. Most orc threats are local. A warg emerges, rolls through a sector, gets stopped or contained by Imperial or Xenos forces, and the immediate threat is over, even as the underlying infestation continues. The beast's empire is not a local threat. It has reached a scale that makes it a civilizational challenge to the Imperium rather than a military one. The attack moon over Terra is not a weapon being deployed in a battle. It is a statement about the relative power of the two civilizations, and the statement is, you are not safe anywhere. The Imperium's response is characterized initially by institutional dysfunction. Should the High Lords argue while worlds burn, and into this disaster steps Corland, captain of the Imperial Fist's Second Company, and eventually, after the devastation of the war's opening moves reduces the entire chapter to one survivor, the last son of Rogel Dawn, alive. His rise to Lord Commander of the Imperium is one of the more compelling character arcs in recent Warhammer fiction. A man who starts as a mid-ranking officer, watches his institution fail catastrophically, finds himself the inheritor of a legacy reduced to him alone, and responds by doing the impossible over and over because the alternative is not doing anything. The idea of reconstituting the Death Watch, the Xenos hunting kill teams that combine warriors from multiple chapters into specialized units, is Corland's. The diplomatic effort to bring multiple chapter masters into unified command is his. And the intelligence that leads him to Caldera is his. Or rather, the intelligence arrives in a direction that he is open to following, when most of his contemporaries would have filed it as impossible. Acting on intelligence from inquisitorial representative Veritas, Corland learned that the Primarch of the Salamanders had been spotted. Not dead, not a historical figure in the records. Alive, active, fighting, on a volcanic world called Caldera. Corland led a task force there, and what he found changes the shape of the entire story. Vulcan was defending Caldera alone, against an orc planetary invasion force of millions. Without backup, without relief, without any prospect of either arriving. He had been holding them off, not losing, not retreating, not dying, holding. When Corland's task force arrived and turned the tide, scattering the invasion, Vulcan was still standing in the wreckage of what had been a battlefield, doom tremor in his hands, looking for the next thing that needed to stop. The detail of Caldera deserves more attention than it usually receives. The fact that Vulcan is on a volcanic world when Corland finds him is not a coincidence, and probably not a random choice on Vulcan's part. A Primarch who has been operating independently for 1500 years, who is a perpetual and cannot be permanently killed, who has been alone since the decades following the Siege of Terra. This is not a person who ends up in places by accident. Vulcan was somewhere specific because he chose to be there. But whether he was drawn to Caldera by intelligence about the Orc invasion, or by something else, the pull of a world that resembled his home, some knowledge about what the Orc incursion in that region meant for the broader pattern of the Beast's campaign, the lore does not tell us. But he was there, alone, fighting millions of Orcs with a hammer he had built himself, and he had not lost. The conversation between them is remarkably human in the context of a setting that usually processes feeling through layers of military formality. Vulcan recognized in Corland something the Imperial Fist's sons always carried, the quality of Rogel Dawn, and said so. He said he would speak well of Corland to Dawn, which Corland noted was a statement with implications. If Dawn was dead at that point in the law's official timeline, or what did it mean to speak of seeing him again? The law has not resolved this definitively. Multiple interpretations remain possible, and all of them suggest Vulcan knows something about Primarch mortality and continuity that the official records do not contain. Whether this reflects actual knowledge of Dawn's status, the long view of a perpetual who considers death differently than an ordinary person, or something else entirely, it is a passage that rewards thinking about. The campaign to Ullanor that followed was the largest military operation the Imperium had mounted since the heresy. Vulcan led it nominally, while Corland managed the operational complexity, which was itself a reflection of Vulcan's characteristic approach. He trusted the person best suited for the work to do the work, rather than insisting on leading everything himself simply because he was a Primarch. He spent the voyage to Ullanor in isolation, finishing Doomtremor at the forge, as always, the craftsman preparing for battle by building the thing he was going to fight with. This is not trivial. Vulcan had 15 centuries to observe the Imperium as it actually functioned, stripped of the mythology surrounding its founding. He knew, better than anyone alive at that point, the difference between what the Imperium had been built to be and what it had become. He had watched the gradual calcification of the institutions Guilliman had designed, the slow corruption of the ideals the Crusade had championed, the 10,000 ways in which survival had been prioritized over the values that supposedly made survival worth pursuing. And he had watched all of this, and he was helping anyway, because helping was the thing he did regardless of whether the institution was working the way it should. He did not require the Imperium to deserve help before giving it. He helped because there were ordinary people whose lives depended on the help, and he had never needed a better reason than that. When the Imperial forces reached Gorkogrod, the beast's capital, Vulcan entered the fight directly. He led the charge into the beast's temple Gargant, a walking fortress the size of a titan, the ultimate expression of Orc technological ambition, and confronted the most powerful greenskin ever recorded in single combat. The beast stood 10 meters tall, spoke in perfect High Gothic, and told Vulcan that humanity was finished, that the Orcs would finally take what had been denied them. As Vulcan did not engage with the speech, he attacked. They fought deep into the heart of the Gargant, and Vulcan made the choice that the Promethean creed, taken to its logical extreme, always implies. He drove them both into the power generator and absorbed the enormous psychic field of the Orc energy system, the gestalt power of their entire species, concentrated in that one machine. And rather than being consumed by it, he channeled it all into Doomtremor and struck the beast one final time. The detonation that followed destroyed the Temple Gargant and presumably both of its occupants. The Imperium retreated from Ullanor, believing their Primarch had given his life to buy them a victory. Corland stated that Vulcan's sacrifice would be forever remembered. He was presumed dead, not confirmed dead, presumed. And that word, in the context of a perpetual, is doing an enormous amount of work. Think about what happened in the detonation. Vulcan channeled the psychic gestalt of the entire Orc species, a genuinely enormous force, one of the most powerful ambient psychic fields in the galaxy, and used it as a weapon. He absorbed it rather than being destroyed by it. That is an extraordinary capability, and it is consistent with what a perpetual biology at the level of a Primarch might be able to do. But it is not straightforward. It is not the same as simply dying and regenerating. Whether the force involved in that particular detonation was sufficient to actually kill him, or whether it was the kind of thing that a perpetual rebounds from eventually regardless of how long the process takes, is the question the lore leaves open. But the beast was powerful enough that the Orc Empire needed to be fought again later, which suggests The first victory on Ullanor was not as complete as the survivors believed. What this means for Vulcan's specific condition after the detonation is one of the setting's more interesting unresolved threads. He was presumed dead. The salamanders mourned him. Corland added his name to the rolls of honored dead, died himself in subsequent fighting, and the war eventually came to its conclusion. The Imperium endured, as it always does, in worse shape than before, but not finished, which is the Imperium's defining quality. It absorbs damage that would destroy any rational institution and keeps functioning through the accumulated inertia of 10,000 years of weight. And somewhere, was in a smouldering crater on Ullanor, or in the void, somewhere between stars, or in some deep corner of the galaxy that none of the surviving records of the war looked carefully at, a perpetual Primarch lay still. Perhaps dead in the temporary sense that has never been permanent for him. Perhaps injured beyond even his extraordinary capacity to rapidly heal, requiring years or decades of slow regeneration. Perhaps awake and choosing to be elsewhere, for reasons the setting has not yet revealed. Presumed dead, not confirmed dead. The distinction matters more here than almost anywhere else in the lore. Part 9. The current era. 5 of 9. The setting is now the late 41st millennium. Cadia has fallen. The Great Rift has torn across the galaxy from the Eye of Terror to the eastern fringe. Yet the Imperium is split in half. The Imperium Sanctus on one side, struggling under Guilliman's returned leadership. The Imperium Nihilus on the other, cut off from the Astronomican's light, fighting in a darkness that the warp storms make truly absolute. The Lion has awakened. New armies of Primaris Space Marines march under the Indomitus Crusade. Everything is worse and moving faster toward worse, and Vulcan Histan is still searching. The current Forgefather operates alone through this burning galaxy, following the encrypted passages of the Tome of Fire from world to world, calling on the chapter's full resources when the trail requires it, and going alone when it does not. He carries 3 artifacts into every engagement. He follows leads. He decodes passages in the tome that previous Forgefathers could not decipher, adding his own interpretations to the accumulated understanding of generations who have all been trying to know the same thing. How Vulcan thought, what he meant, where he hid the things he hid, and why he chose those specific places. The Tome of Fire itself is a remarkable object, not just as a plot device, but as a piece of world building. Vulcan wrote it over the course of however long he spent in the period between the heresy's end and his departure, potentially decades, potentially longer, depending on how his experience of time worked during periods of independent operation. It contains his personal philosophy, his recorded observations about the galaxy and the Imperium and the nature of the things they were fighting, his understanding of what the salamanders were supposed to be and why, and embedded within this, key in a code whose key is knowledge of how Vulcan thought rather than a conventional cipher, the locations of the 9 artifacts. Previous Forgefathers have recovered 5. Each recovery presumably added something to the collective understanding of how Vulcan encoded his meaning. Each success teaching the next Forgefather a little more about the shape of his mind, the patterns in his reasoning, the particular way he thought about concealment and revelation. 5 of 9 is not a failure. 5 of 9, across 9,000 years of searching with the limited resources of a single chapter operating in a galaxy that keeps trying to end, is a testament to sustained purpose. 5 recovered, 4 left. The Unbound Flame, the Obsidian Chariot, the Song of Entropy, the Engine of Woes, known by name, unknown in location, are locked in riddles written 10,000 years ago by a mind that spent those 10,000 years continuing to exist somewhere outside the records. After the Great Rift's creation, Histan traveled to a world called Zero, following a Tome of Fire lead about the Unbound Flame's location. This is important because it establishes that the search is active right now in the current era, following live intelligence rather than simply maintaining a tradition. The quest is progressing, and for the first time in history, the salamanders are no longer conducting it alone. The Covenant of Fire, and the Hammers of Nocturne, two Ultima founding successor chapters created from Primaris stock, have deployed multiple companies in the search. Other chapters with salamanders, Heritage, have sent smaller forces. But the scale of the enterprise has expanded precisely when the galaxy is most in need of every resource available. This means something. Chapters don't commit significant forces to relic hunts during existential crises because tradition demands it. They commit because they believe the prophecy has weight, because they believe that when the 9th artifact is placed on Nocturne soil, something will happen that is worth the cost of the resources spent finding it. The salamanders themselves in the current era are a fascinating institution to look at, partly because they are one of the few chapters that has processed the arrival of Primaris Space Marines without significant internal conflict. Their culture of brotherhood and the primacy of the community's well-being over individual pride made the integration of the new warriors relatively straightforward. You did not need to be the specific kind of Space Marine you had always been in order to belong to the salamanders. You needed to hold the values and do the work and stand with your brothers. The Primaris salamanders stepped into that definition and found it fit them as naturally as it fit everyone else. This is itself a reflection of Vulcan's philosophy, working exactly as it was designed to. The values outlasted the specific form they were originally expressed in. 10,000 years of institutional practice had embedded them deep enough that a fundamental change in what salamanders physically were did not disrupt what salamanders were in the way that mattered. Now the fire had moved into new material and was still burning. There is also the question of Trazyn the Infinite, which deserves its own mention because it is one of the setting's more persistently unresolved threads, and it directly involves the salamanders and their artifacts. Trazyn is a Necron overlord of Solemnes, a being of enormous age and incomprehensible longevity, whose particular fixation is the collection of significant objects and preserved individuals from across the galaxy's history. He has stasis-preserved figures from dozens of civilizations, including Imperial Space Marines and historically significant individuals, in his vast underground galleries. He has made at least 2 documented attempts to steal the Spear of Vulcan from Histan, which establishes that Trazyn considers it a prize worth pursuing. Thus, the frequently speculated possibility that Trazyn has Vulcan himself in stasis somewhere in the galleries of Solemnes has never been confirmed, but it has also never been definitively ruled out. And Trazyn's track record of turning up with significant historical figures preserved in his collection at convenient moments is long enough that dismissing the theory requires more evidence than the lore currently provides. If Trazyn does have Vulcan, the question of what that means for the prophecy is interesting. The prophecy requires all 9 artifacts to come to Nocturne. Nothing in what Vulcan said required him to be free and active, and walking into Nocturne under his own power when they arrived. A Vulcan preserved in Necron stasis, and eventually returned to Nocturne when the 9th artifact is found would still be Vulcan. Was the fire in the stasis field would still be the fire. Whether he would be grateful to Trazyn about the arrangement, or deeply annoyed, is a separate question, and the lore's characterization of both figures makes either outcome plausible. 5 of 9, 4 to go. The search is active in the current era, in the most chaotic moment in 10,000 years of Imperial history, which is either terrible timing or exactly the right timing, depending on whether you believe that the Vulcan prophecy has always been pointing toward this moment as the crisis it was designed to address. The salamanders believe the latter. 10,000 years of sustained faith in a Primarch who left and told them to work toward his return. Not a Primarch who died and was mourned, but one who gave his sons a task and trusted them to complete it, does not waver in the face of a crisis. It intensifies, because the crisis is precisely the kind of thing the return is supposed to address. The Great Rift is not a reason to give up looking. It is a reason to look harder. Part 10. The philosophy that makes him different. It is worth sitting with what Vulcan actually represents in a setting that tends to process its values through the lens of war and survival, because the answer to that question is the deepest reason why his return matters more than the military capability of a single Primarch. Every Primarch received an aspect of the Emperor through the process of their creation. Some received his martial genius, some received his administrative capability, and his ability to hold vast structures together through organizational will. Some received his terrible ruthlessness, his willingness to do whatever was necessary for humanity's long-term survival, even when the immediate cost was catastrophic. Vulcan received his humanity in the most literal sense. The Emperor, who had been living as an incomprehensible ancient being, operating on scales of consequence that made individual human lives essentially invisible, had somewhere within him the memory of what it meant to be human, what it meant to care about specific people, what it meant to feel the weight of another person's life as something irreplaceable and precious. Distilled and amplified, and given shape by Nocturne's culture of survival and community, that quality became Vulcan. The Promethean Creed has three major pillars: self-reliance, the capacity to sustain yourself and those in your care without dependency; self-sacrifice, the willingness to give everything for the protection of others; and the circle of fire, the understanding that destruction and rebirth are the same cycle, that what the flame consumes, it also transforms and returns. These are not abstract philosophical positions. They are embedded in the daily practice of the salamander's culture in ways that other chapters' philosophies are not. A salamander does not fight for the Imperium in the abstract. He fights for specific people, the ones he knows by name, the communities that raised his predecessors, the children of the families that will eventually produce his successors. This specificity is strange in the setting. The Adeptus Astartes are designed to be post-human, yet removed from ordinary concerns, precisely because the work they do would be impossible for someone who felt the full weight of every death. The mechanism of space marine creation strips away a great deal of ordinary human feeling, replaces it with engineered loyalty and enhanced capability, and the ability to function in circumstances that would shatter any ordinary mind. The salamanders went through the same process. They are not ordinary humans, but they kept something that the process often removes, and they kept it deliberately, as a practice and a value rather than as a failure to fully complete the transformation. The salamanders' relationship with their homeworld is the clearest institutional expression of this philosophy, and every other Space Marine chapter maintains the distance that demigods tend to maintain from the ordinary mortals whose world they occasionally visit. The salamanders go home. They live in the sanctuary cities, in bastions within the settlements that raise the gene seed's forebears. They know their neighbors. They watch generations of ordinary Nocturnians be born and grow old and die, while the Astartes persist, and they do not use that difference as a reason to detach. They use it as a reason to value the brevity of mortal lives more fully, because they know how finite those lives are. This is Vulcan's gift to the salamanders, and it is, arguably, the quality most missing from the broader Imperium of the current era, where the combination of the Great Rift, the breakdown of communication across the split galaxy, and 10,000 years of institutional calcification has produced a civilization that is increasingly operating on the logic of survival, rather than the logic of what survival is supposed to protect. The Imperium under Guilliman's returned leadership is trying to be better. Guilliman genuinely cares about the people of the Imperium. He has reformed institutions that had grown monstrous, pushed back against excesses, attempted to restore the rational humanism of the early Crusade period. But Guilliman's relationship to ordinary humanity is the relationship of an administrator to a population, broad, systemic, structural. He thinks in terms of billions and the best policies for managing their welfare. He does not, in the same way Vulcan does, think in terms of the specific person standing in front of him right now and what that person's life requires. Vulcan thinks that way. He always has. And a galaxy being torn apart by forces that view ordinary human lives as infinitely expendable, whether that is the chaos gods devouring souls for their gratification, or the Tyranids consuming biospheres for biomass, or the Necrons pursuing their patient reclamation of the galaxy, could desperately use a Primarch whose fundamental orientation is protective rather than merely aggressive. There is also the question of what Vulcan knows. He has had 10,000 years of independent operation. He was not in stasis like the Lion. He was not bound to a wounded body's slow recovery like Guilliman before his resurrection. He was walking around the galaxy, alive, watching things, is experiencing things, accumulating the perspective of a being who cannot die and who has been present for the entire span of the Imperium's existence as something more than a historical monument. The Vulcan who eventually returns to Nocturne when the 9th artifact is found will carry 10,000 years of observation and endurance and the particular wisdom that only comes from having been through everything and come out the other side, still fundamentally yourself. Part 11. The Flame That Would Not Go Out. There is something worth reflecting on quietly here. Something the Vulcan story is specifically about, that goes beyond the mechanics of lore and into the territory of what stories are actually for. Warhammer 40,000 as a setting is defined by its refusal of easy answers and false hope. The Imperium is a terrible institution. It is sustained by suffering, run by bureaucracies so calcified they can barely respond to change, defended by warriors shaped into something that can barely be called human. The forces opposing the Imperium are, almost without exception, worse. The setting is a sustained meditation on what it costs to survive, what compromises are made, what is lost, what is traded away for the ability to keep going one more day against opponents as relentless as they are varied. Vulcan's story exists in this setting, but refuses to be entirely defined by it. He is the Primarch who has paid every possible cost of survival, died more times than anyone else in the setting, been tortured to a degree that defies adequate description, and lost his sons, and watched the civilization he helped defend become something he would not recognize from the outside. And he has not become what those experiences usually produce. He has not become Kersey, who decided darkness was universal and surrendered to it. He has not become a weapon that has forgotten it was once a person. He has not calculated himself into a position where protecting himself matters more than protecting others.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.